The ending of The Testaments, episode 9, was far darker than most people realized on first watch, because what looked like a simple act of rage was actually the moment everything inside Gilead stopped pretending to be controlled. The writers didn't end the episode with chaos. They ended it with clarity, a quiet, almost peaceful silence after violence. And that is exactly what made it so disturbing.
Are you trying to ruin my life, or are you just crazy? Come on, she's evil. I told you she's evil.
Because when Becca finally confronted Dr. Grove, the show wasn't just staging a murder scene. It was revealing how deeply corruption had already rooted itself inside the system that raised her. This was not an emotional outburst that came out of nowhere. It was the final breaking point of years of silence, denial, and conditioning collapsing into one irreversible action. The episode carefully guided the audience toward discomfort long before the killing happened. Every interaction between Becca and Dr. Grove had already been loaded with tension that nobody inside the story fully addressed out loud. On the surface, he appeared respected, intelligent, and untouchable within the structure of Gilead, but underneath that image, the truth had already started leaking through. The show never needed to loudly expose him earlier, because it was already building toward a different kind of horror.
What a pity. He was such a good dentist.
The realization that systems like this don't break in public, they rot in private. When Becca entered that bathroom scene, the tone of the entire episode shifted. There were no dramatic speeches, no external witnesses, and no heroic interruption. Just silence. That silence mattered, because it forced the moment to feel intimate rather than theatrical. What followed was not portrayed like a stylized action sequence. It was slow, unstable, and human. The violence did not feel empowering. It felt inevitable. And that is where the darker meaning begins to surface. The murder itself was not the climax, it was the symptom. Becca's decision was shaped by everything she had been forced to endure without language for it. Inside Gilead's structure, truth is not openly discussed. It is buried under authority, religion, and fear. So when the truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive as justice. It arrived ruptured. Dr. Grove was not just a person in that moment. He represented the entire system of protection that had allowed harm to exist unchecked for years. And the most disturbing part is what happens immediately after. There is no triumph. There is no relief. There is only an aftermath. Becca's emotional state does not land in clarity. It collapses into fragmentation. The show doesn't frame her as a victorious figure. It frames her as someone who has crossed a boundary that cannot be uncrossed. That distinction is what separates this moment from typical revenge storytelling. This was not liberation, it was contamination. And that is where the episode's real darkness settles in. Because once the violence is done, the system does not fall. It continues. It absorbs. It adapts. Dr. Grove's death does not trigger justice within Gilead. It exposes how isolated truth really is inside it. One act of rebellion, no matter how emotionally justified, does not dismantle the structure that produced it. It only reveals how many more layers of silence are still standing behind it. That is why the episode feels heavier in hindsight, because it quietly confirms a pattern the series has been building all along. In Gilead, consequences are never contained. They spread. They reshape everyone involved. And Becca's choice becomes the turning point that redefines her entire path going forward. Not because it frees her, but because it binds her to the same system she tried to escape. Violence inside Gilead is never just an ending. It is an initiation. By the time the episode closes, the audience is left sitting in a strange emotional contradiction. The person responsible for the worst act in the episode is also the person who has suffered most from the world that created it. And the show refuses to resolve that contradiction cleanly. That is why episode 9 lingers. Because the real horror was not the murder itself. It was the realization that nothing truly ended when it was over. The system remained. The silence remained. And Becca, now changed forever, remained inside it. And that is why the ending of episode 9 was far darker than it first appeared. It did not show a collapse of power. It showed how power survives even after everything else breaks. And that is where the episode's final emotional weight settles in. After the violence, after the silence, after the moment everyone expected to feel like closure, the story refuses to give anything resembling peace. Because what the episode quietly reveals is that Becca's act did not remove the problem, it relocated it. Inside the world of the Testaments, power is never tied to one person. It is tied to structure. So even after Dr. Grove's death, the system he existed in remains fully intact. The rules do not change. The hierarchy does not collapse. The silence does not lift. Instead, everything tightens. People become more careful, more controlled, more fearful of being associated with anything that might disrupt the order. And that is where the real psychological horror begins. Because Becca is no longer just a witness to corruption, she has now become something the system can use. The episode subtly shifts how other characters begin to perceive her in the aftermath. Not openly, not dramatically, but in small behavioral changes. Longer pauses before speaking to her. Careful language. A growing sense that she is no longer just a student or a daughter within Gilead's framework. She has become a variable that must be managed. That is the hidden cost the episode never announces directly. In most stories, killing the source of harm creates resolution. In this story, it creates visibility. And visibility inside Gilead is dangerous. Because once you are seen as capable of breaking rules, even for understandable reasons, you are no longer outside the system. You are inside its surveillance logic. And that is the darker twist the episode leaves behind without saying it out loud. Becca did not escape Gilead by committing that act. She stepped deeper into it. Meanwhile, Agnes exists on the opposite side of the emotional fracture. Where Becca's storyline is defined by immediate consequence and physical action, Agnes' arc is defined by interpretation, what she is told, what she is allowed to understand, and what is deliberately withheld from her. And the further the episode moves away from the murder, the clearer it becomes that truth in this world is not just hidden, it is curated. That difference between what is seen and what is understood becomes the second layer of the episode's darkness, because the audience is watching everything unfold, but the characters are not. And that gap is where the real tragedy lives. By the final moments, the episode is no longer about Dr. Grove at all. His death has already been absorbed by the narrative machinery of Gilead. What remains is the shift in tone, an irreversible realization that every act of resistance inside this world is immediately rewritten by the system it tries to oppose. The writers do not present rebellion as failure. They present it as a transformation. Once something breaks inside Gilead, it does not disappear. It evolves into something else, something quieter, something more controlled, something harder to recognize as violence at all. And that is why the ending feels heavier in hindsight, because it suggests that the real danger was never the single act of murder. It was what the system would turn that moment into afterward. And as the episode closes, there is no sense that the story is moving toward justice. It is moving toward adaptation. Gilead does not collapse. It adjusts. And Becca, whether she realizes it or not, has now become part of that adjustment. That is the final layer of the episode's darkness. Not that something terrible happened, but that nothing truly changed because of it.